Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. This is a podcast where I read old books, sometimes fiction, sometimes non-fiction, in the most boring way I can to try and help you slow your spinning mind, enough for you to fall asleep in the most natural way possible. The stresses of life often follow us to bed and keep us company, but I'm here to distract you from them and help you drift away. Before you do fall asleep, if you do find Sleepy Time Tales helpful, and you would like to support me to keep it going out to you and thousands of your fellow insomniacs, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. Incidentally, there is also a 7-day free trial on that, so if you want to sign up to check out to see what you're getting, feel free to do so. If monthly is a bit much, you can also put a tip in the tip jar, and both of these are linked in the show notes. Or you can support Sleepy Time Tales by simply spreading the word. If you know someone struggling to sleep, just tell them about it and where to find it. But to get back to the bedtime story, you are going to fall asleep learning more than you ever dreamed possible about some great Italian painters of history. So snuggle down, close your eyes, breathe deeply and listen closely as I lead you down the path to sleep. A History of Art for Beginners and Students, Painting, Sculpture, Architecture, by Clara Erskine Clement Waters. In 1548, Charles V summoned Titian to Augsburg, and while there made him a count, and gave him a yearly pension of 200 gold ducats. The emperor was very fond of Titian and spent a good deal of time with him. On one occasion, the painter dropped his brush. The emperor picked it up and returned it to him. The etiquette of courts forbade anyone to receive such a service from the sovereign, and Titian was much embarrassed when Charles said, "Titian is worthy to be served by Caesar," this being one of the great ruler's titles. Charles continued his favors to Titian through his life, and when he resigned his crown and retired to the monastery of Mysti, he took 9 pictures of this master into his solitude. One of these, a portrait of the Empress Isabella, was so hung that the emperor gazed upon it when dying. This is now in the museum at Madrid, where also many fine works by Titian, for Philip II was his patron as his father had been. When 85 years old, he finished his wonderful picture of the martyrdom of St. Lawrence for the Church of Jesuits in Venice, and his old age was one of strength and mental clearness. Though he had seen great prosperity and received many honors, he had not escaped sorrow. After the death of his wife, his sister Orsa, who was very dear to him, had kept his house. She too sickened and died. His son Pomponio was a worthless fellow and caused him much grief. Lavinia had married, and the old man was left with Orazio alone, who was a dutiful son. He also was an artist, but painted so frequently on the same canvas with his father that his works cannot be spoken of separately. At length Titian's work began to show his years, and someone told him that his Annunciation did not resemble his usual pictures. He was very angry, and seizing a pencil wrote upon it, "Titianus fecit fecit," meaning to say by this, "Truly Titian did this." When he was 96 years old, he was visited by Henry III of France, attended by a train of princes and nobles. The aged painter appeared with such grace and dignity as to excite the admiration of all. And when the king asked the price of some pictures, Titian presented them to him as one sovereign might make a gift to another who was his equal and no more. In 1576, the plague broke out in Venice, and both Titian and Orazio fell victims to it. Naturally, the man of 98 years could not recover, and though Orazio was borne off to the hospital and cared for as well as possible, he also died. After Titian was left alone, robbers entered his house while he still lived, and carried away jewels, money, and pictures. He died August 27th, and all Venice mourned for him. There was a law that no person who died of the plague in Venice should be buried within the city, but Titian was so much honored and beloved that the exception was made, and he was buried in the church of Santa Maria Gloriosa de Frari, or as it is usually called, the Frari. He had painted a great picture of the Assumption for this church, which has since been removed to the Academy of Venice. But another work of his, called the Pizarro altarpiece, still remains near his grave. His burial place is marked by a simple tablet inscribed thus: "Here lies the great Tiziano de Vercelli, rival of Zeuxis and Apelles." A little more than 2 centuries after his death, the citizens of Venice determined to erect a monument to Titian, and Canova made a design for it. But political troubles interfered and prevented the execution of the plan. In 1852, the Emperor of Austria, Ferdinand I, placed a costly monument near his grave. It consists of a Corinthian canopy beneath which is a sitting statue of the painter, while several other allegorical figures are added to increase its magnificence. This monument was dedicated with imposing ceremonies, and it is curious to note that not far away from it, the sculptor Canova is buried, and his own monument is made from the design which he made for that of Titian. Some writers consider the entombment of Christ in the Manfrini Palace as the greatest work of Titian. At all events, it is the best existing representation of the subject, and is a picture which has had great effect upon art. Its chief feature is the general expression of sorrow which pervades the whole work. Titian gave a new importance to landscape painting by making backgrounds to his pictures from natural scenery, and then not as if it was merely for the sake of a background, but in a manner which showed his love for nature, and in fact he often rendered it with poetical significance. The works of Titian are very seldom sold. One subject which he oftentimes repeated was that of Danae, with a shower of gold falling about her. One of these was purchased by the Emperor of Russia for 600,000 francs. One of the most important of his religious pieces was that of St. Peter Martyr. This was burned in the church of St. Giovanni e Paolo in Venice in 1868. An excellent copy of it had been for a long time in the Museum of Florence, and this was presented to the Venetians in order to repair their loss as far as possible. Victor Amadeus of Sardinia presented 9 pictures by Titian to the Duke of Marlborough, and these were all destroyed in 1861 when the Chateau of Blenheim was burned. Kugler says, in the multifariousness of his powers, Titian takes precedence of all the other painters of his school. Indeed, there is scarcely a line of art which in his long and very active life he did not enrich. His last work was not quite completed by himself, and is now in the Academy of Venice. It is a Pieta, and although the hand of 98 years guided the brush uncertainly, yet it has the wonderful light this master threw around his figures, and the whole is conceived with his accustomed animation. The pupils and followers of Titian were too numerous to be spoken of one by one, and none of them were so great as to require their mention in detail here. Yet they were so good that while the other schools of Italy were decreasing in importance during the 16th century, that of Venice was flourishing, and some great masters still existed there. Among these was Jacopo Robusti, 1512 to 1594, who was called and is best known as Tintoretto, which name was given to him because his father was a dyer. He studied under Titian for a time, and then he attempted to follow Michelangelo, and it is said that his motto was, "The coloring of Titian, the drawing of Michelangelo." His best pictures are slightly treated, and others are coarse and unfinished in the manner of painting. His portraits seem to be his best works, probably because they are more carefully finished. Several of his works are simply enormous, One is 74 by 30 feet. The School of St. Roche has 57 large pictures by him, in many of which the figures are of life size. His two most famous works are the Miracle of St. Mark in the Academy of Venice, and the Crucifixion in the School of St. Roche. The last is, for every reason, his best work. There are crowds of people in it, on foot and on horseback, while their faces show every possible kind of expression, and their movements are infinitely varied. The immense painting mentioned above is in the Doge's Palace, and is called Paradise. His daughter Marietta Robusti, 1560 to 1590, was a pupil of her father's, and became so good a portrait painter that she was invited to the court of Spain by Philip II. But her father could not consent to a separation from her. Some excellent pictures of her still exist, and her portraits of Marco de Vescovi and the antiquarian Strada were celebrated pictures. When the Emperor Maximilian and the Archduke Ferdinand, each in turn, desired her presence at their courts, her father hastened to marry her to Mario Augusti, a wealthy German jeweler, upon the condition that she should remain in her father's house. She was celebrated for her beauty, had fine musical talents, and was sprightly and enthusiastic. Her father was so fond of having her with him that he sometimes allowed her to dress as a boy and go with him to study where young girls were not admitted. When but 30 years old, Marietta Robusti died. She was buried in the church of Santa Maria dell'Orto, where there are several works by her father. Both he and her husband mourned her for all their remaining days. Many pictures of Tintoretto painting his daughter's portrait after her death have been made by later artists. Paoli Caligari, or Cagliari, called Paul Veronese, 1528 to 1588, was born at Verona. But as he lived mostly at Venice, he belongs to the school of that city. He was an imitator of Titian, whom he did not equal. Still, he was a fine painter. His excellences were in his harmonious color, his good arrangement of his figures in the foreground, and his fine architectural backgrounds. He tried to make his works magnificent, and to do this he painted festive scenes, with many figures in splendid costumes. He is buried in the church of St. Sebastian, where there are many of his works. In the gallery of the Louvre is his Marriage at Cana. It is 30 by 20 feet in size, and many of its figures are portraits. His pictures are numerous and are seen in the European galleries. The family of Darius in the National Gallery, London, cost that institution the enormous sum of £13,650. It was formerly at the Pisani Palace, Venice, and was said to have been left there by Veronese as a payment for his entertainment during a visit he had made in the palace. In 1868, at the Demidov sale, a portrait of his daughter sold for £2,524. At the close of the 16th century, a family of a father and 4 sons were busy painting what might rightfully be termed the earliest genre pictures of Italy. The term is used to denote pictures that stand between historical and utterly imaginary subjects. That is to say, the representation of something that seems real to us, because it is so familiar to our imagination, or because it is something that we know might have happened, that it has all the naturalness of an actual reproduction of a fact. There may be interior or landscape genre pictures. The first represent familiar indoor scenes. The latter are landscapes with animals or figures to give a life element and to tell a story. The name of the family of which I speak was De Ponte, but it was called Bassano, from the birthplace of Jacopo de Ponte Bassano, 1510 to 1592, the father who was the most important of the family. He studied in Venice but returned to his native town. His portraits are fine. Among them are those of the Doge of Venice, Ariosto, and Tasso. His works are very numerous and are seen in all galleries. He introduced landscapes and animals into most of his pictures, sometimes with great impropriety. We come now to Antonio Allegri, called Correggio, 1493 to 1534, who was born at the end of the 15th, but did his work in the beginning of the 16th century. His name of Correggio is that of his birthplace, and as he was not born at any of the great art centers and did not adopt the precise manner of any school, he with his followers stand by themselves, and yet because his principal works were done at Parma, he is sometimes said to be of the school of Parma. When Correggio was 13 years old, he had learned to draw well. He studied under Andrea Mantegna and his son Francesco Mantegna. From these masters he learned to be very skillful in drawing, especially in foreshortening or in representing objects seen aslant. But though he learned much of the science of art from his teachers, his grace in movement and his exquisite light and shade are all his own, for they did not possess these qualities. Foreshortening is so important that I must try to explain it. And, as Correggio is said to be the greatest master in this art since the days of the Greeks, it is quite proper for me to speak of it in connection with him. The art of foreshortening is that which makes different objects painted on a plane or flat surface appear as if they were at different distances from the eye of the person who is looking at the picture, or as scenes in nature appear, where one part is much further off than another. To produce this effect, it is often necessary to make an object, let us say, for example, an arm or a leg, look as if it was stretched forward out of the canvas, directly toward the person who is looking at it. Now, the truth is that in order to produce this effect, the object is often thrown backward in the drawing. Sometimes also it is doubled up in an unnatural manner and occupies a small space on the canvas, while it appears to be life-size when one looks at it. A Christ in Glory painted by Correggio in the cupola of the Church of St. Giovanni Evangelista in Parma is a fine piece of foreshortening. The head is so thrown back and the knees are so thrown forward that the whole figure seems to be of life-size. Yet if the space from the top of the head to the soles of the feet were measured, it would be found to be much less than the height of the same figure would be if it were drawn in an erect position. I have already explained the meaning of chiaroscuro, and this delicate manner of passing from light to shade was another quality in the works of Correggio. It is even seen in his early works, as for instance in the beautiful Madonna di San Francesco, now at Dresden, which he painted when he was but 18 years old. When this master was 26 years old, he married Girolama Nolini, and about the same time he was summoned to Mantua by the Duke Federico Gonzaga. During 11 years after his marriage, he was occupied with works in Mantua, and with his great frescoes at Parma. In 1530 he returned to Correggio, and there passed the remainder of his life. That he held a high position is proved by certain records of his life, among which is the fact that in 1533 he was invited to be one of the witnesses of the marriage of the Lord of Correggio. It is said that when this painter saw one of the great works of Raphael, he exclaimed enthusiastically and thankfully, "I too am a painter." And no doubt he then felt himself moved to attempt such works as should make his name known to all the world through future centuries. When Titian saw Correggio's frescoes at Parma, he said, "Were I not Titian, I should wish to be Correggio." Annibale Carracci, also a great artist, said of Correggio more than 100 years after his death, "He was the only painter," and declared that the children he painted seemed to breathe and smile with such grace that one was forced to smile and be happy with them. In 1534, Correggio died of a fever and was buried in his family tomb in the Franciscan convent of his native city. His grave is simply marked with his name and the date of his death. Some of his oil paintings are very famous. One at Dresden representing the Nativity of the Savior is called the Notte, or Night, because the only light on the picture comes from the halo of glory around the head of the Holy Child. Correggio's Reading Magdalene is in the same gallery. Probably no one picture exists which has been more universally admired than this. There was a larger work of his representing the shepherds adoring their infant Saviour at Seville in Spain. During the Peninsular War, 1808 to 1814, the people of that city sent many valuable things to Cadiz for safety, and this picture, on account of its size, was cut in two. By some accident, the two parts were separated, but both were sold, and the purchaser of each was promised that the other portion should be given him. From this much trouble arose, because both purchasers determined to keep what they had, and each claimed that the whole belonged to him. And as they were equally obstinate, the two parts of the same work have never been reunited. Fortunately, each half makes a picture by itself. The frescoes at Parma are the greatest works of this master, and it is very interesting to visit that quaint old city. His works are in the cathedral, the Church of St. John the Evangelist, and in the parlour of the convent of the Benedictine nuns. This last is a wonderful room. The ceiling is arched and high and painted to represent an arbour of vines with 16 oval openings, out of which frolicsome children are peeping, as if in passing around behind the vines, they had stopped to look down into the room. The pictures here will make you understand the effects. Beneath each of these openings or lunettes is a half-circular picture of some mythological story or personage. Upon the wall of the parlour, above the mantel, there is a picture of Diana, the goddess of the moon and the protector of young animals, which is a beautiful picture. When Correggio worked on the frescoes at the Church of St. John, he lived much in the monastery connected with it. The monks became very fond of him, and made him a member of the congregation Cassinense. The poet Tasso was also a member of this fraternity. This membership gave him the right to share in the masses, prayers, and alms of the community, and after his death the same offices for the purpose of his soul would be performed as if he had been a true monk. The works of Correggio are very rarely sold. The Madonna in the National Gallery, London, known as La Via Giovanile, was formerly in the Royal Gallery at Madrid. During the French invasion of Spain, Mr. Wallace, an English artist, obtained it. It is painted on a panel and is 13.5 inches high by 10 inches wide. In 1813 it was offered for sale in London at £1,200. In 1825 it was sold in Paris for 80,000 francs, and soon after sold to the National Gallery for £3,800, or nearly $19,000. A copy of the Reading Magdalene was sold to Earl Dudley for £1,600, or more than $7,000. Correggio had but few pupils, but he had many imitators. The one most worthy of mention was Francesco Mazzulli, 1503 to 1540, called Il Parmigiano, or Parmigianino. He was not a great painter. The Vision of St. Jerome in the National Gallery, London, is one of his best works. It is said that during the sack of Rome in 1527, he was painting the figures of the Virgin and Child in this picture, and was so engrossed by his work that the invaders entered his studio and surrounded him before he was aware of their approach. And they, for their part, were so moved by what they saw that they went away and left him undisturbed. Art writers often use the term early masters. This denotes Michelangelo, Raphael, and other men so great that they were very prominent in the history of art and were imitated by so many followers that they had an unusual effect upon the world. Titian may be called the last of these great masters of the early school, and his life was so long that he lived to see a great decline in art. The painters of the close of the 16th century are called Mannerists, which means that they adopted or imitated the manner or style of some great master who had preceded them. And this was done in so cold and spiritless a way that it may be said that the true artistic inspiration was dead in Italy. No one lived who, out of his own imagination, could fix upon the wall or the canvas such scenes as would befit a poet's dream, or serve to arouse the enthusiasm of those who saw the painted story born in the artist's brain. About 1600, the beginning of the 17th century, there arose a new movement in Italian art, which resulted in forming two schools between which there came to be much bitterness of feeling, and even deadly hatred. On the one side, there were those who wished to continue the study and imitation of the works of the old masters, but with this they united a study of nature. These men were called eclectics because they elected, or chose certain parts of different systems of painting, and from these formed a new manner of their own. Opposed to the eclectics were the naturalists, who insisted that nature only should be studied, and that everything should be represented in the most realistic way, and made to appear in the picture exactly as it did in reality, not being beautified or adorned by any play of fancy or imagination. The chief school of the eclectics, of whom I will first speak, was at Bologna, and is known also as the school of the Carracci, because Ludovico Carracci, 1555 to 1619, was at the head of a large academy there, and was assisted by his nephews Agostino Carracci, 1558 to 1601, and Annibale Carracci, 1560 to 1609, the latter being the greatest artist of the three. The lives of the Carracci are not of such interest as to require an account of them here. Neither are their works so interesting that we may not leave these artists by saying that they have great consideration as the heads of the eclectic academy, and for the work they did in it at an important era in the history of Italian art. But the fruits of their work are shown in that of their scholars rather than in their own paintings, and in this view their influence can scarcely be overvalued. The greatest of their scholars was Domenico Zampieri, 1581 to 1641, called Domenichino, who was born at Bologna and was instructed by Denis Calvert, who forbade his drawing after the works of Annibale Carracci. Domenico disobeyed this command, and was so severely treated by Calvert that he persuaded his father to take him from that master, and place him in the school of the Carracci. When he entered the academy, he was so dull that his fellow pupils nicknamed him the Ox. But Annibale Carracci said, "Take care. This ox will surpass you all by and by, and will be an honor to his art." Domenichino soon began to win many prizes in the school, and left it well trained and prepared for a brilliant career. He gave much thought to his art, shunned private society, and if he went out at all, he frequented public places where large number of people were gathered, thus affording him an opportunity to study their varying expressions. He also tried to feel in himself the emotions of the person he was painting. For instance, it is said that when he was painting the Scourging of St. Andrew, he threw himself into a passion and used threatening gestures and high words. In the midst of this, his master, Annibale Carracci, surprised him, and was so impressed with his method that he threw his arms about his pupil's neck, exclaiming, "Today, my Domenichino, thou art teaching me." The most celebrated work by Domenichino is the Communion of St. Jerome in the Vatican. It is universally considered the second picture in Rome, the Transfiguration by Raphael being the only one that is placed before it. The scene it represents is just before the death of the saint, when he was borne into the chapel to receive the sacrament of the communion for the last time. Domenichino was made very unhappy in Rome on account of the jealousy of other artists, and he returned to Bologna. However, his fame had reached the court at Naples, and the viceroy of that city invited the artist to decorate the chapel of St. Januarius. There was in Naples at that time an association of artists who had determined that no strange artist should be allowed to do work of any account in their city. As soon as Domenichino began his work, therefore, he received letters threatening his life. His colors were spoiled by having ruinous chemicals mixed with them. His sketches were stolen from his studio, and all sorts of insults and indignities were heaped upon him. After a time, the painter was so disheartened that he fled to Rome, but the viceroy sent for him and took every precaution possible to protect him and enable him to work in peace. But just as all seemed to be going well, he sickened and died, and it has always been said that he was poisoned. Be this as it may, there is no doubt that the fear, vexation, and anxiety of his life caused his death, and on this account his tormentors were his murderers. The works of Domenichino are not numerous, and are not seen in as many galleries as those of some Italian painters. But there are a considerable number scattered over Europe, and very beautiful ones in several galleries in Rome. The next painter of importance in the eclectic school was Guido Reni, 1575 to 1642, born at Bologna and the son of a professor of music. His father intended that Guido also should be a musician, and the poor boy was much persecuted on account of his love for drawing. But after many struggles, the boy came to the Traci school, and was soon a favorite pupil there. When still young, he listened with great attention to a lecture from Annibale, in which he laid down the rules which should govern a true painter. Guido resolved to follow these rules closely, and soon he painted so well that he was accused of trying to establish a new system of painting. At last, Ludovico Carracci turned against him and dismissed him from his school. The young artist went to Rome, but his persecutions did not cease, and it seemed to be his fate to excite the jealousy of other painters. Now, when so much time has elapsed, we know that Guido was not a very great master, and had he painted in the days of Michelangelo, he would not have been thought so. But art had lowered its standard, and Guido's works were suited to the taste of his time. He had a high conception of beauty, and he tried to reach it in his pictures. In the course of his career, Guido really painted in three styles. His earliest pictures are the strongest. Those of his middle period are weaker, because he seemed only to strive to represent grace and sweetness. His latest pictures are careless and unequal in execution, for he grew indifferent to fame, and became so fond of gaming that he only painted in order to get money to spend in this sinful folly. His masterpiece in Rome was the Aurora, on a ceiling of the Rospigliosi Palace. It represents the goddess of the dawn as floating before the chariot of Apollo, or Phoebus, the god of the sun. She scatters flowers upon the earth. He holds the reins over 4 piebald and white horses, while Cupid with his lighted torch floats just above them. Around the chariot dance 7 graceful female figures which represent the hours, or Horae. I have been asked why 7 was the number. The ancients had no fixed number for the hours. Sometimes they were spoken of as 2, again 3, and even in some cases as 10. It has always seemed to me that 10 was the number chosen by Guido, for in that case there would naturally be 3 out of sight, on the side of the chariot which is not seen. The portrait of Beatrice Cenci is another very celebrated picture by Guido. It is in the gallery of the Barberini Palace in Rome. The interest in the portrait of this unhappy girl is worldwide. She was the daughter of a wealthy Roman noble, who after the death of her mother married a second time, and treated the children of his first marriage in a brutal way. It is even said that he hired assassins to murder 2 of his sons on their return from a journey to Spain. The story also relates that his cruelty to Beatrice was such that, with the aid of his stepmother and her brother, she killed him. At all events, these 3 were accused of this crime, and were executed for it in 1599. Other accounts say that he was murdered by robbers, and his wife and children were made to appear as if guilty. Clement VII was the Pope at that time, and in spite of his knowledge of the cruelty of the father, he would not pardon them, though mercy was implored of him for this lovely girl. The reason given for this action of the Pope's is that he wished to confiscate the Cenci estates, which he could do if the family suffered the death penalty. So many reproductions of this sad face have been made that it is very familiar to us. It almost seems to have been the face of someone whom we have known. Guido did not paint his St. Michael for the Cappuccini in Rome until after he returned to his native city. When he sent the picture to the monks, he wrote, "I wish I had the wings of an angel to have ascended into paradise, and there to have beholden the forms of these beatified spirits, from which I might have copied my archangel. But not being able to mount so high, it is in vain for me to search for his resemblance here below, so that I was forced to make the introspection into my own mind, and into that idea of beauty which I formed in my own imagination." We are told that he always tried to paint his ideal of beauty, rather than to reproduce any human beauty that he had seen. He would pose his color grinder and draw its outlines from him, and then fill in with his own conceptions of what the head he was painting should be. This accounts for the sameness in his heads and faces. His passion for gaming degraded the close of his life. It led him into great distresses, and for the sake of money he painted many pictures which are not worthy of his name. He had always received generous prices for his pictures, but he left many debts as a blot upon his memory. His works are seen in the galleries of Europe and are always admired for their feeling, beauty, and grace. Francesco Albani, 1578 to 1660, born at Bologna, was another scholar of the Carracci school and a friend of Guido Reni. There are many works of his in Rome. His pictures of landscapes with figures were his best works, and beauty was his characteristic. His own home and all the advantages for painting such works as he best succeeded in, such as Venus and the Loves, maids and boys, children and cupids in unending variety. His villa was surrounded by charming views. His wife was very handsome, and they had 12 lovely children. So lovely, it is said, that other artists besides himself made use of them for models. There were several other eclectics of some importance of whom we shall not speak, but we shall leave them with an account of Elisabetta Serrani, 1640 to 1665, who was also born at Bologna, and is worthy of attention on account of her talents, while the story of her life adds another interest than that which she has as an artist. She was an imitator of the attractive manner of Guido Reni. The heads of her Madonnas and Magdalens are charming, and indeed, all her work speaks of the innate refinement of her nature. Her industry was marvelous, since she made 150 pictures and etchings in a period of about 10 years. Much has been said of the rapidity with which she worked, and one story relates that on a certain day the Duchess of Brunswick, the Duchess of Mirandola, and the Duke Cosimo de' Medici, with other persons, met in her studio, and she sketched and shaded drawings of subjects which they named for her, with a skill and celerity which astonished and delighted her guests. Her masterpiece is a picture of St. Anthony adoring the Virgin and Child, which is in the Pinacoteca of Bologna. The pictures by her in the Belvedere and Liechtenstein galleries at Vienna, in the Hermitage at St. Petersburg, and in the Sciarra Palace, Rome. In person, Elisabetta Serrani was beautiful, and her character commanded the affection of all who knew her. She was a sweet singer, and her biographers increased her virtues by praising her taste in dress, and even her moderation in eating. She was skillful in domestic affairs and was in the habit of rising early to perform her share in the household duties, never allowing her art to displace any occupation which properly made a part of her life. Her name has come down through more than 2 centuries as one whose devoted filial affection, feminine grace, and artless benignity of manner added a luster to her great talents, and completed a personality which her friends regarded as an ideal of perfection. She died very suddenly, and the cause of her death has never been known, but the theory that she was poisoned has been generally accepted. Several reasons for the crime have been given. One is that she was the victim of jealous artists, as Domenichino had been, that a princely lover whom she had scorned thus revenged himself. A servant girl in her family was suspected of the crime, tried and banished. But after a time she was recalled to Bologna at the request of the father of Elisabetta, for he saw no proof of the girl's guilt. Thus the mystery was never solved, but the whole city of Bologna was saddened by her death. The day of her burial was one of public mourning. Her funeral was attended with great pomp, and she was buried beside Guido Reni in the splendid church of the Dominicans. Poems and orations in her praise were numerous, and a book was published called Il Pannello Lacrimate, which contained these with odes, anagrams, and epitaphs, in both Latin and Italian, all setting forth her charms and virtues. Her portrait in the Ercolani Gallery at Bologna represents her when occupied in painting her father's portrait. According to this picture, she had a tall, elegant figure and a very pretty face. She had 2 sisters, Barbara and Anna Maria, who also were artists, but her fame was so much greater than theirs that she quite overshadowed them. And on that sad note, before we get to the work of the rival school of the naturalists, I'm going to call it there. You can, as always, find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night, and sweet dreams.